think a lot of us came into this thinking that the biggest data gaps would be in the climate space, sort of understanding what future conditions might look like, how to represent those in our models. That's not untrue, right? There are still plenty of gaps in climate data, but we have found through talking with a lot of these companies that there are probably even bigger gaps.
The Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, is a nonprofit independent research and development group focused on improving the generation, delivery, and use of electricity. The organization's goal is to benefit the general public by helping address ongoing challenges in the energy industry, including resilience and reliability, which brings us to the topic of today's show. The Atlantic hurricane season is now underway. Peak wildfire season isn't too far off, and in the face of more widespread and destructive natural disasters, utilities from coast to coast are taking a hard look at their infrastructure and how they might harden it for when disaster strikes. EPRI has been working on its Climate Resilience and Adaptation Initiative, or Climate READi, power framework since 2022. Through robust collaboration with more than 40 electric companies and more than 100 academic, consulting, finance institutions, national labs, regulators, and government agencies, EPRI finally published a quote-unquote finished trove of resources in May 2025. Now more than ever, it is imperative that the power sector evaluates its current and future resilience to extreme weather and climate-related hazards to ensure reliability for customers. And that's exactly what the Climate READi initiative intends to help with. Proactive, integrated planning tools, strategies to prioritize climate adaptation and promote resilience, identifying investment opportunities, and more. In this episode, I'm joined by two of the masterminds behind EPRI's effort, who will dive into all that encompasses and share how we all benefit. I'm Paul Gerke, and you're listening to Factor This. Today on the Factor This podcast, we're joined by Laura Fischer and Andrea Staid, both with EPRI and the Energy Systems and Climate Analysis Group, to talk about one of EPRI's new initiatives. And when I say new, it's not that new. You guys have been working on it for 3 years, but the full framework just published in May 2025. Andrea, Laura, tell me a little bit about what this initiative is all about.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Climate READi is aiming to provide consistent guidance for utility companies who are trying to plan for climate change in the power sector. And there's a lot that goes into that regarding the use of climate data, the vulnerabilities of various assets and how we can represent those, and how all of this sort of plays in system modeling and decision making. And so we have a very large set of resources, some guidance documents, some sort of references that folks can look to for examples and further information, and even some tools that we share to help folks really navigate this landscape of what it means to plan for climate change. And it can mean something very different for different types of companies based on where they are and what sort of systems or assets they have.
I think what I would also add, Paul, in addition to what Andrea said, is that this has really been a collaborative effort. So the Climate READi initiative has worked with more than 40 utilities from around the world. And we also have a network of technical organizations that can provide additional technical expertise through our Climate READi affinity group. And these organizations have been participating over the course of Climate READi, along with EPRI and the member companies, to help develop the framework. So we really see this as the results of extensive collaboration across the electricity sector.
Laura, can you go into a little more detail about who you were collaborating with? 40 utilities, that seems like a pretty large number. That's a solid sample size.
Yeah, we were really pleased to have, like I said, over 40 companies, not just in the States, but also in Canada and Europe. And we had a diversity of different types of companies representing different structures, investor-owned utilities, public power agencies, smaller, larger companies. Also, some companies that are vertically integrated, others that only focus on segments of the power system, perhaps wires only or only own generation. A lot of geographic diversity as well. And so we really feel like we were able to capture a nice cross-section of the industry. Within our Climate READi affinity group, this was a network of organizations that like I mentioned, provide additional technical expertise or insight that could be leveraged as part of the Climate Ready framework. And so some types of organizations that were included there would have been national labs, universities, consulting firms, other research and development organizations, technology firms, a whole host of organizations that were involved in helping us develop this framework.
Can we back up just a little bit now that we've laid out the groundwork and exactly what this is, and we'll get into more detail about Climate Ready in just a minute. But I want to take you back to April 2022 when this initiative started. What was the impetus then, and how much has that part of the power sector changed since you started this? I'm sure there was some reconfiguring on the fly, if you will.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. I think there is a fast-growing need, largely driven by the number of extreme weather events that we've been seeing around the world. So a fast-growing need for folks to get a better handle on what it means to plan for these events. There's a pretty large body of work around the benefits of being proactive when it comes to climate change, and so you can sort of look at some high-level studies that show what it would cost if we wait for these events to happen and then react, right, and then fix the grid, versus if we're proactive and we take a forward-looking view of what future operating conditions will look like, put those investments needed in the ground now, right, to make sure that we can better withstand those events when they do happen. And if you look at, again, some of these higher-level studies, they're showing orders of magnitude savings from being proactive when it comes to this. And so that's great, right? It's great that we all know we need to be proactive, agree that we need to be proactive, but it is really hard to figure out what that means, especially when you don't have unlimited dollars, right? We can't just build anything we want anywhere we want. It's a lot of prioritization and figuring out which decisions actually come with meaningful benefits, weighing those against a whole lot of options that you might be considering. It's also really challenging to sort of include climate in planning that has a lot of other objectives and uncertainties, right? We are facing growing demand in a lot of places, which means we need more generation. We are facing decarbonization targets, which is really good, right, to help mitigate the climate problem in the first place. But that, again, means a lot of changes to what power companies are doing. And so it's sort of like trying to get this climate question into an already complex planning space. And that's why we thought we needed a focused investment on this guidance, right? So really focusing on okay, how can you get this into your already complex decision space? Let's try to break it down into some actionable steps.
In addition to what Andrea said, I would add a couple of other things. So one is that we were already seeing activity in this space, already seeing companies assessing the potential risk that climate conditions, changes in climate pose to their assets and to their systems. But the approaches were fairly fragmented, kind of different across the sector. And so there was a desire for consistency in the approach. Not necessarily consistency in the results, the kind of choices that companies make in terms of what resilience options to pursue and what their strategy is going to look like differs depending on the company. But at least Climate Ready could offer a consistent process and set of methods for assessing physical climate risk and evaluating adaptation options. So I think one of the things that really motivated us to start on this work was recognizing that there was work going on in this space, and EPRI could offer an opportunity to look at what's already going on and what methods do we want to pull into the framework, where do we maybe need to innovate and do some additional research to provide new guidance on how to do this type of work. But like Andrea said, we've observed changes in climate and weather, and we expect more in the future, and that's a motivator for the work. Also, with decarbonization and other transitions that are going on in the power sector, we're becoming a more weather-dependent system. So we need to really understand the intersection of climate with our models that help us understand how we are generating and transmitting electricity. And then with the projected increasing reliance on electricity, we want to make sure that we are able to keep the lights on as much as possible during these types of events.
I feel like one of the most challenging parts of this is organizing disparate resources. What was the greatest challenge for you in determining what made the cut and what didn't, especially when you're talking about providing resources for such a large and diverse group of stakeholders?
Yeah, great question. We did draw a lot of lines around what climate ready is and what it is not. And we really tried to focus on the question of resilience, which can sometimes be different from affordability, can sometimes be different from reliability in some cases. But thinking about resilience as okay, how do we make sure society is, largely okay when these potentially disruptive events happen, right? When we see these high stress weather conditions, let's focus on sort of the social aspect of resilience, not necessarily profit margins or anything like that. But I don't know that was necessarily like the hardest part, right? We sort of set some boundaries around what ready is. I think some of the challenges came with, as you said, like putting the information together and getting the right folks to understand enough of what the other experts, had to offer, right? So getting the power system modelers to talk to the climate data experts, right? So we have these climate scientists and we have folks who are, deep in the weeds of power system simulations, and understanding what each can offer and what each needs in order to like successfully run their model or provide the right type of data, I think was much more challenging than we anticipated. And so we had, the climate data experts, we had asset subject matter experts for every, from transmission towers to every generator type, batteries, et cetera, and just understanding the needs of each other took a lot more time than I think any of us anticipated.
Yeah, Paul, when you said organizing disparate resources, where my mind immediately went was something that Andrea talked about in terms of making sure that we are connecting the right people within the companies, because there's not going to be one single person that has all of the knowledge or maintains all of the data or runs all of the models that would be needed for an effort like this. And this is true within EPRI as well. We, as part of the framework development, utilized and leveraged expertise from many different research groups within EPRI. So not just our climate data team, but also our system modeling team and our asset subject matter experts. And so that is something that we've really tried to focus on in Climate Ready, is helping companies understand who needs to participate in this process. What organizations do you need or business units within your company may have information that you're going to need, kind of who needs to be on the same page to align on assumptions and objectives. And that can sometimes be just as difficult, if not more difficult, than actually running the analysis, kind of doing all of that preparatory work first.
It sounds to me like back when I was a kid and you're like playing on an Xbox or something, you're building your Madden football team and you just spend like 6 hours like creating the logo and the jerseys and naming the players, and then you just don't really want to play anymore because you put all of the effort into the organization. Does it feel a little bit like that for you guys, or is there a kind of a relief that you've got this out into the world and you don't have to stress anymore about what to put into it? Or is this a living document? Are we editing it live?
So it's definitely... Yeah, I was going to say, it's definitely a living document. And we spent 3 years putting it together, and we've been able to test some elements of it. We've done case studies and kind of other analyses over the course of Ready to be able to test out and see how different elements of the framework are being implemented. But I think, so Ready is concluding as an initiative in May of this year. We're setting up a new longer term research program in January 2026 that will carry the Ready torch forward. And I think what we'd like to focus on over the next couple of years is seeing how the framework is being implemented and adopted and seeing where it's applied. And then that will give us a sense of, okay, what elements of the framework are easily adopted, are, no pun intended, readily adopted. And we can call that out and say, like, the users of the framework are pretty consistent here. But that can also show us, what elements of the framework, for one reason or another, may be having less traction. It may be because the data are not available to support the type of analysis. It may be because it's difficult to link certain types of models. And so we see READi as a living framework. We want to be able to update it at different intervals as new research comes out, as we're able to incorporate more information. We'd like to be able to show how it's being utilized by the electric power sector. And so I'm looking forward actually to seeing kind of how it evolves over time.
Anything you wanted to add on that, Andrea?
I mean, I like your Madden example. I feel like it's more than setting up the team and not wanting to play. It's a little bit more like we didn't even set up the team. We just put a bunch of players on the field, and we're hoping they
play together well. Yeah.
Yeah, they can figure out how to
It's
make
more
a
like
team
drafting a fantasy football team than another thing I've never been particularly good at.
Right. It's like, oh, just take, our hundreds of pages of guidance and hopefully you can figure it out on your own.
Don't light yourself on fire with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Laura, I want to go back to something you said a second ago before I forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to put a peg into a quote where you said that no one has all of the knowledge. And that's obviously true. We also live and operate in a time when a lot of the stakeholders that are relevant to this discussion are dealing with workforce challenges. It's not just that one person doesn't know everything. It's that there's a lot of things that were known that aren't known anymore. Lost knowledge transfer problems, data being passed from one generation of the workforce to the next in not a very clean way. I know that this isn't necessarily the focus of this initiative, but what role did the ongoing workforce challenges in the industry play in you crafting READi?
Yeah, so I don't know if we kind of saw that specifically within the development of the framework, but I'm hopeful that something like the Climate READi framework can help document some of those data needs or document some of those modeling linkages so that as we do see workforce turnover or, as we see folks exiting the workforce or coming into the workforce, we can help preserve some of that institutional knowledge by saying, this is the type of data that you would need to do this assessment, or this is the modeling setup that you would need. Also, over the course of Climate READi, we've developed some training modules to help get power system practitioners who may be less familiar with working with climate data or less familiar with the modeling setup that they can take to help them level set on key concepts and terminology. And so those training modules are available online. They're self-guided, so you can watch a recording, you can take the training. EPRI can also facilitate a training as well. And that's something that we could continue to develop in the future. So if we've identified a need for training in a specific area of the framework, then we can work on developing a module in the future.
When you were putting all this together, did you encounter any surprises, good or bad, that maybe that someone was a little further along on some things than you realized, or maybe that things were a little more disorganized than you even imagined?
I think one of the surprises that actually we keep coming back to is that, climate change is hard and there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think a lot of us came into this thinking that the biggest data gaps would be in the climate space, sort of understanding what future conditions might look like, how to represent those in our models. That's not untrue, right? There are still plenty of gaps in climate data, but we have found through talking with a lot of these companies that there are probably even bigger gaps in the utility infrastructure data that they just don't always have, right? And there's a lot of information that you want to have in your models to properly represent, an asset's expected performance under different types of future conditions. And it depends on the design standard of that asset. It depends on the age, sort of, whether it's been maintained properly, where it even is. In some cases, right, there are literally millions of poles. Not everyone might know exactly where every single one of them is, even in a utility company. And that is really challenging, right? When you're trying to sort of like map the space of geographical climate risks onto assets and you're not even sure what those assets exactly are and what sort of maintenance has been performed on them. It turns out that matters, and that's like a challenge of collecting massive amounts of data over time. And I think a lot of these companies haven't had a dedicated use case for that sort of long time history of this asset information. And so we're trying to, again, encourage some better data practices in those spaces.
Yeah, and Andrea characterized that really well, thinking about even just having data for the current network configuration and current location of assets and their historical performance during different types of events. The other aspect is that, Climate READi is trying to understand what future conditions might look like. And usually we're looking, multiple years, if not decades in the future. But in order to kind of really do an assessment there, you need to understand what is the power system going to look like decades in the future. And there's a lot of uncertainty there, just like the sense that there's uncertainty in what the climate may be. But there is, it's sometimes very hard to develop a set of scenarios or a kind of range of representations of what that future power system will look like, because if you have a sense of what the future climate conditions will look like, even if there is uncertainty, you want to make sure that you are evaluating the impact of those weather and climate events on the kind of plausible system configuration. And it just can be really hard to identify that, not only 10 years in the future, but even 5 years in the future, because there can be a mismatch between the utility, like long-term planning horizon, and when we see these changes manifesting. But some of these assets are very long-lived assets. So, you put something in the ground now, it's expected to be around for 30 or 40 years. And so in that lifetime, you might see changes in climate conditions. And so you want to be paying attention to that.
Especially considering how much more frequent and severe weather events have become in the United States, to put it broadly, including wildfires in that discussion. We've seen a lot of movement in the utility space on hardening and resilience, implementation of drone technologies and sensors on lines. To your point, I've also heard that there are utilities out there that don't know where all of their assets are, that everything is not digitized, and we're, that's an ongoing effort too. If you, and I know this is probably tough because we're talking about a lot of different utilities in different parts of the world with unique challenges, but are there a few basic hardening and resilience strategies that Climate READi, if you're just like, I've got a quick message for the utilities out there, do X, Y, and Z, is there something like that?
I would love if there were a perfect answer.
It's just that simple.
It is very hazard specific, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I think, as you said, like, we've seen some great examples of utility companies in Florida, for example, really locking down what it means to be resilient to hurricanes, right? And that's a lot of stronger poles and really good vegetation management, in some cases selective undergrounding of, like, maybe some critical circuits. Wildfires is different, right? There's both the threat of wildfires to the power system and the threat of the power system in terms of sparking wildfires. And those are different, different problems with different solutions. So again, there's no one size fits all, and it does really depend on what we would propose out of Climate READi, a comprehensive risk assessment of what you are trying to reach, right? What you're trying to achieve. But yeah, I think, there are certainly some adaptations for concerns around high heat. There are inlet air chillers that can be used on some thermal generators that can allow you to sort of maintain a higher capacity when it gets really hot. So again, it depends on sort of where you are and what sort of those margins of risk are, like what is really putting you at that level of extreme stress on the system, and then you can focus on doing something about that.
Yeah, two other things I would add there, Paul. One is I would encourage folks to check out the Climate READi Asset Climate Vulnerability and Adaptation Inventory, which is an online database. You can search it by asset class or hazard type, and I believe it has over 250 climate-related vulnerabilities for different asset classes. I think it's 27 hazard categories. And then it has multiple adaptations identified. For some vulnerabilities, there are a few different adaptation strategies identified. For other vulnerabilities, there may not be an adaptation strategy identified, but this is something that we hope to build out even after READi as well, and refine. But this is a way for companies to see, okay, what are the different identified vulnerabilities? Also, maybe your company has an adaptation strategy that you are considering. You can see how it might compare with other adaptation strategies that are identified there, or if it's an adaptation that is not listed in the inventory, then a company could come to EPRI and say, hey, we've worked on this and it seems like it's worked well, so perhaps we could add that back in there. The other thing that I would mention, so, Andrea talked about how adaptation options are very hazard specific, and I certainly agree with that. One thing that we're also seeing companies do is trying to identify adaptations or response options that respond to multiple hazards. So they're very interested in multi-hazard analysis. So on the one hand, you could have an adaptation that provides some protection or benefit against multiple individual hazards, or we're starting to see more examples of compound events where you have, for example, a heat wave that follows a hurricane, or a wildfire and a heat wave occurring simultaneously, and trying to think about different adaptations or response options that provide benefit for events that are occurring simultaneously or within quick succession.
This framework came out last month at the time of this recording, so I know there's not a huge runway for feedback yet, but what feedback have you received from the stakeholders that are interested in a compilation of such resources?
Well, luckily we didn't publish everything all at once, so there have been some resources coming out over the course of the 3 years. And actually a large part of how we engaged our utility company members and that affinity group is by allowing them to provide feedback on draft documents. And so we would send out these early drafts. We got a ton of feedback, right? A ton of engagement in terms of, because they're the ultimate customers. They want this to meet their needs. And so if there was something we missed or something that wasn't clear, they were very quick to call us out. So I will say that I think our documents are much improved because we went through that review process with them. But since the framework has been published, it has only been a month or so. The feedback has been positive, right? There are a lot of folks who are really thankful that they now have everything in one place, right? They've sort of seen the progress as it's been evolving, but now they have everything and can use the compass to sort of navigate this really broad space of resources and understand where to get started. We also have tried to be really clear about okay, here are the basic principles, right? This is complicated, but if you want to just get started, let's focus on these basic principles. And yeah, we've gotten some really positive feedback on sort of that approach and the navigability of the compass. And Laura was the lead author of the compass, and I'm sure she's pleased to hear this.
Yeah, I would say another aspect of READi where we've gotten consistently positive feedback is the fact that all the READi resources are publicly available. So that means that even companies who did not participate in the development of READi, or other stakeholder organizations who maybe have not been involved in READi, can still access the information and the insights coming out of READi. And this was a very intentional decision on EPRI's part, one, because we think that it's broadly beneficial for the power sector to be thinking about the impact of weather and climate on the system. And this is something that would kind of benefit the public at large to have more consistency in how we do this. So that was part of the driving factor. But also we think that framework resources can be used by companies when they are responding to requests from stakeholders. There may be some regulatory regimes that they're under where they want to point to Climate READi guidance or the framework. And so having that publicly available, having that transparent, that those methods be transparent, I think just helps with adoption and utilization of the framework within the power sector.
I got to call a spade here. It's just bad producing on my part to wait 25 minutes into the podcast to mention that these are all free access tools. You would think that if we didn't mention it, that there was probably some sort of fee associated with accessing some of this stuff, but yeah. It's not. It's actually free. And we just buried a really cool piece of information late in the show for those of you who stuck around. Appreciate that. Was there any decision at some point to be this stuff needs to be gate kept in some way, or is it just so important right now, especially considering how many areas in the U.S. are impacted, not just the U.S. but North America and the world at large, that it's just no, this needs to be public and it needs to be free? Was that a core tenet of this?
I think it was pretty early on that we determined that the resources would be freely available to the public. I know the first deliverable that we published out of Climate READi, which was a white paper kind of documenting the motivations and the needs for this, was freely available to the public. And from there, we just kept going with that strategy. I mean, another thing is that a lot of the material that we rely on, like definitely from a climate data side, is publicly available climate data. So we wanted, we point to our use of publicly available climate data within the framework. We have a climate data inventory that documents different climate data sets that can be utilized by the power sector. And I think if we're going for a framework and an approach that can be consistent and collaborative, if it's going to be consistent, it's important for people to have access to all of the elements of the framework and all of the insights. Because if there are barriers to access, then I think it makes it hard for things to be consistently adopted.
And I guess one other point on that, if folks are using different approaches and they don't know what their neighbors are doing or what sort of, the interdependent sectors are doing, I think it makes it a lot harder to understand what your actual resilience is, right? If someone's planning only for wildfires and ignoring flooding risk, and you're planning only for flooding risk and ignoring wildfires, then, those events will have like drastically different impacts in a very interconnected system. And so you can't just sort of like ignore the fact that your neighbors are part of this. And we're hoping that there will be, some shared knowledge around the fact that this is a publicly available and consistent framework for folks to adopt.
I feel like you're both driving at this, but I do want to hammer on the collaboration point, because this isn't the only initiative that's trying to get the right hand to talk to the left hand. And those conversations are, as you mentioned, difficult sometimes, especially when you're talking to utilities who, in some places, were very used to doing things a certain way for a very long time and are now having to open up their minds a little bit and interact in the space and play nice in a sandbox with folks that they probably never had to interact with before. It seems like, just based on the tone and based on the description of how this was all put together, that collaboration aspect went pretty smoothly on your end. It doesn't sound like there was a lot of hesitancy from the utilities to whether it's sharing data or participating in this larger framework. Is that correct?
I mean, the data sharing is always challenging.
Tough. Yeah.
And so we certainly ran into some, I wouldn't say, some long lead times in sort of getting some of what we were hoping to get there.
It's PC.
But the thing is, like, it wasn't because folks didn't want to be collaborative, right? It's because there are other legal hurdles in place within both organizations, right? Even on the EPRI side, to sort of make these things happen. But the other thing maybe to note is that the folks from these companies who are involved are the ones who care about climate resilience. They probably still have to go back to their own organizations and fight this fight among all of the other, complex decisions and investments that their companies are considering. But we are just hoping that we're giving them the tools to like make the case for climate resilience, make the case that these considerations can be part of your sort of broader and general planning, again, in like this collaborative way, because it's something that all of these companies have come to the table and agreed upon as far as a need and an approach.
And I think also everyone appreciated that EPRI was able to convene a bunch of different stakeholders and interested parties in the same room as we were working through Climate READi. So, we obviously had our utility participants, and I think the companies enjoy learning from each other as well and understanding what approaches may have been adopted by other utilities that are facing similar challenges, and if they're able to share what they've been working on with other utilities, that can be helpful. But then also the ability to bring in those other stakeholders like the climate data providers or other research groups that are thinking about how to model the impact of or the consequences of climate change in the same room. So something else that we did over the course of Climate READi was we worked with national labs and had 4 regional public workshops. So these workshops were actually open to the public, and we did them in 4 different regions around the country, and they were focused on different hazards and aspects of the power system. And that was an opportunity to bring interested parties from many different groups in the same room, and also bring folks from the public in to be able to talk about this. And so my experience was that people really wanted to be collaborative in this space. And like Andrea said, sometimes some of the challenges that we faced with data sharing were more just because there are legal hurdles in place, and that's understandable. Some of this information is proprietary and sensitive, so we don't want to be we want to be careful about kind of what we're sharing there. But generally speaking, there was a strong spirit of collaboration throughout Climate READi.
EPRI is far from a one-trick pony. It's not like you guys are going to put this document out and maybe update it and just call it a career. You teased a little earlier a new initiative coming out in January 2026. I don't want to blow the lid on it or say anything we're not supposed to, but can you speak in generalities about what else you guys are working on?
Yeah, so Climate READi was an initiative. It was intended to be a 3-year initiative. It was sort of intended to galvanize work in this area, kind of bring everyone together to develop this common, consistent, and collaborative framework. And we've done our job. We've developed the framework. We've published it, but we don't want it to, just be out there and then not be implemented or not be developed. So that's why we're setting up this new longer-term research program. It's called our Climate Risk and Resilience Research Program that will be starting in January 2026. And we see that as an opportunity to continue research to demonstrate how to use the Climate READi framework, but also to advance the Climate READi framework. And that's just, I think, a reflection of the fact that we think that this work is important and we want it to continue in the future. And we know that we made a lot of progress under READi as an initiative, but there's still more work to be done in the future.
Yeah, I will say that a lot of the work that we did publish sort of ends with here are the known research gaps, right? We did all this work, but we couldn't answer everything in 3 years. And so we are really, really clear about which areas we think just need more, right? Need more to understand the trade-offs or the sensitivities of when you do, A versus B. And so we don't want this to end. We want to sort of keep tackling those gaps and seeing which ones we can fill.
You mean the research, not the podcast, right? Because we're past half an hour now, and maybe people are tired of hearing about it, and they just are already clicking around on the website. We're going to make sure to include the link to the compass here in the article posted on Factor This that has the podcast in it. If you're listening to this via Buzzsprout distribution on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you get your podcasts, head on over to Factor This and check out the compass. Andrea and Laura and their team have put a ton of work into this, and we want to make sure it gets in front of as many stakeholders as possible. Andrea, Laura, I really appreciate your time in joining the Factor This podcast to talk about this really important stuff. Anything you want to leave our listeners with? Perhaps a larger message about your initiatives or maybe just a token of goodwill during these tumultuous times in the energy sector?
Oof, yeah. Well, thanks for having us. This has been really fun. Climate change is not going away, and we can't just ignore the problem. So let's make sure we're all sort of keeping it front and center as we try to think long term here.
Yeah, and I would say also thank you. And like I said, Climate READi is a living document. So if folks go through it and they have feedback and they have suggestions for how to improve in the future or what research to pursue, feel free to get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to talk through that.
Laura, Andrea, really appreciate your time and the work EPRI is doing. Thank you for joining the Factor This podcast.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.